Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Matters of the Mind presentation. So, understanding suicide and how you can help. And so, in a moment, I'm going to introduce Matt, who you'll see on the screen somewhere over there. Uh, what I'd love to quickly do is just introduce what these presentations are and who the BCACC even is. So, these are Matters of the Mind presentations, and we put these on as a way of really bringing forward the knowledge and expertise of members of our association because they are the helpers of the province. And so these are recorded and then they go onto our website as a resource that you can share around with anyone who you would find would get value out of it. And if you don't know who the BCACC is, we are the British Columbia Association of Clinical Counselors. We have something like over 9,000 members, registered clinical counselors in the province. And the at the BCACC, we really hold our counselors to a true high standard. One of our mandates is safe and effective counseling for all of the people of BC. So tonight, I am thrilled. Let me just get my slides up for one moment to welcome Matt. And we've had multiple back and forths with Matt. In many ways, we've got a great relationship with the CMHA, Canadian Mental Health Association. Matt works for the BC Division chapter. You can clarify in one moment. Yeah. So Matt is an RCC and manager of suicide prevention and life promotion at the CMHABC, and he is dedicated to supporting mental health and well-being across British Columbia. And it's been a joy to work with Matt to bring this forward to all of you. So before I hand over the stage, I'm just going to say that I'm coming tonight from the lands of the Lekwungen speaking people, known today as the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. And I welcome you from everywhere that you are all joining us. And as Matt introduces himself, you can feel free to put in the chat where you're coming from. And I'm just really glad that you're here tonight to join us for this conversation. So thank you so much, Matt, for being here.
And thank you, Nikki, for that lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt. I use he and him pronouns. And like Nikki said, I am a registered clinical counselor myself, but I also work for the Canadian Mental Health Association, the BC division. So I'm kind of here tonight sitting in the dual roles of both those worlds and here to talk to you about suicide prevention. My job title at CMHABC is the Manager of Suicide Prevention and Life Promotion. We've been having great relationships with BCACC, just talking more about advocacy around the counseling sphere and also how we can start to integrate all the work that all of our organizations are doing and start to work together, more unified towards more mental health access for all, but especially in BC. Um, so I'm very excited to be here today talking to you about suicide prevention. It has been my world for the past few years since taking on this role. And as well, being an RCC myself, I understand kind of the counseling lens and how suicide prevention work intersects in the role of a counselor. So I'm looking forward to this presentation and I'm hopeful to kind of bring you both those perspectives as we navigate this topic today. Now, Nikki gave a lovely land acknowledgement, but I would also like to acknowledge that I am also joining from the unceded and traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, otherwise known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. That is colonially known as Victoria, BC. Now, CMHA BC's offices are located in both Victoria and Vancouver, so we also like to acknowledge that we conduct work on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations as well. So kind of keeping with that, we always love to acknowledge the land, but when we're talking about suicide prevention, we do like to kind of add a little bit of a learning into this and introduce a concept that may be familiar to some and maybe a little unfamiliar to others. The concept I'm hoping you're seeing on your screen is called life promotion. And now, life promotion in and of itself, the language there is really intentional, as it's meant to almost mirror yet oppose the language of suicide prevention. So, how this concept kind of came to be was a Council of Indigenous Youth, I believe local to Canada, got together to talk about the higher rates of suicide amongst Indigenous youth and try to brainstorm some solutions. And one of the discussions that really came up was around this idea around how even when we're talking about suicide prevention, it's always really centered on preventing death. We're not really talking about what the after looks like. What does that piece look like? How do we help connect someone with life? How do we help them feel like there is a life worth living beyond the actual suicide prevention? So that is where this concept of life promotion really came from. And the quote on the screen, I just think exemplifies it beautifully. Life promotion encourages people to strengthen a connection to land, community, self, and spirit, equipping them to live a long and prosperous life. Now, we don't have a bunch of time to dive into a lot of the context on life promotion today, but if it is something you want to learn more about, I highly encourage you go to the link on the screen, which is wisepractices.ca. They have tons of resources and other little bits of information around life promotion for further learning if that interests you. Alrighty, folks, a little bit about CMHA. So, you may have heard of us, Canadian Mental Health Association. We are one of Canada's most established charities. We really work to root our policies and programs in evidence, but also, more importantly, informed by people's personal lived and living experience. Our mandate is working towards mental health for all. And a fun fact, especially here in BC, is not only are there over 120 CMHA locations throughout Canada, but 14 of which are in BC. So I'm here today representing the RCCs as well as CMHA BC, but there are also some fantastic regional branches that do some really beautiful community-based work. So I really encourage you to look into your local community. You may have a CMHA branch local that's doing some great work to learn about. They do fantastic mental health programming ranging from addiction support to helping unhoused populations to helping folks navigating links to employment. Just really broad scope of programs offered across the province. And I really would encourage you to do some research into our branches. Now, before we go any farther, we're going to be talking about suicide. That's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about what can we do and maybe even how can we help. So I like to pause before we get into any of the content and just acknowledge that there are a bunch of you here in this digital call with us today, and I don't personally know how suicide has or has not touched your life. Suicide is a very large issue that has likely touched most of us in some way. And so it is very natural that at times some emotions may come up while we're talking around topics like this. And so I just like to pause and share some resources that, again, you may be aware of, or maybe there's some new ones up here that you aren't aware of that are available for immediate support in the event you're feeling like you would like to talk to someone tonight, or if you have someone in your life that you would like to get them connected to support. The first is 988. This is a number that launched in Canada at the end of November in 2023. You can call or text to access 988. It's available across Canada and it is available 24/7 as well. A cool piece about 988 is not only do they offer the services in English and French, but if you are a youth or someone who identifies as Indigenous, they will also help connect you to a resource or support that has those cultural safe resources as well. And I can see Nikki is so quick. She got this screen cap in the chat. That's awesome. So those resources will be there for your consideration throughout the night. The other ones I'll talk about quickly, but 1-800-SUICIDE is BC's 24/7 suicide prevention line. You can call and receive anonymous support related to your own thoughts and feelings of suicide, or if you're supporting someone else, they will help support you in supporting the other person. Right under that, we have 1-800-588-8171. This is the CUAS Indigenous Crisis Line, based out of Port Alberni, but serves the entire province, and they're available by call 24/7. And then the final resource is the Hope for Wellness helpline. You have the phone number on the screen that you can call as well, or if you go onto hopeforwellness.ca, you can actually chat with a responder via online chat. So I share these resources because potentially they might be beneficial for you or they might be beneficial for someone you know in your life. And we're going to go over additional resources later, but I like to just ground us in a little bit of what are some resources we can access immediately if we're feeling the need to talk to someone today. Alrighty. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into the content. Now, we're here to talk first about suicide awareness and stigma reduction. Now, with Matters of the Mind, I know that we have some RCC, some clinical counselors in the audience, as well as some community members. Everyone is here because we want to learn more. I'm hoping there is something in this presentation that everyone can take away from them, but I wanted to root us first in really what is suicide? What are thoughts of suicide? And how does this all kind of contribute to this stigma? And what can we do as caring people to start to combat that? So, to ground today's discussion with some things you're going to hear me say a lot, thoughts of suicide. What am I talking about when I say that? Thoughts of suicide is a very big umbrella term that really is there to exemplify any form of thoughts of suicide that someone may have. This could include when someone has thoughts or desires to actively end their life, or when someone is thinking that they wish they were dead. It's a very big, broad spectrum of what qualifies as a thought of suicide. And part of the reason I like to provide this definition right away is sometimes when we think of thoughts of suicide, we get a little tunnel visioned in on folks that may be actively having a plan to end their life. I just want to really challenge that idea right off the notion and remember that we want to support everyone. All folks that have any form of thought of suicide, whether that's a passing thought that they wish they were dead, or maybe they're more actively planning on steps they may take, we want to get everyone connected to support. So, really broadening our concept of what thoughts of suicide entails. As well, suicide prevention and response. This is the active process in where we're supporting people who may be thinking about suicide with supports or resources that potentially are life saving. So, we're going to talk a lot about what that looks like in section 2. But diving right in, I wanted to talk about some statistics around suicide and really frame that suicide is a public health issue that we all need to pay a bit more attention to. They estimate that there are approximately 4,500 reported suicide deaths per year in Canada. Now, this estimation is not 100% accurate because it's actually really hard to qualify what is a suicide death due to a lot of different reasons. So, with that, there's other estimates that it could potentially be up to 30% more on top of this 4,500 of unreported suicide deaths. So that just goes to show that this is a cause of death that we want to pay attention to. These numbers are quite high, and these are things that we really want to start to tune into, especially because help is out there. Now, branching off of that, they estimate that approximately 100,000 people make some form of a suicide attempt every year. And branching off of that, approximately 5% of people are thinking about suicide at any given moment. So, to frame that a little bit and put that into perspective, approximately 5% is 1 in 20 people. That is some form of thoughts of suicide at any given moment. And that's quite a large statistic. That is really the crux of why we want to help people get support. Is in most social spaces there are 20 or more people, and that doesn't mean that there's always going to be someone thinking about suicide, but it just help contextualize that this is actually a lot more common than we think, and this is how we can start to destigmatize this by talking about this and having open conversations. Now, to bring in some hopeful statistics here, they also estimate that approximately 90% of people who attempt suicide and survive never go on to die by suicide. Now, that's a really important statistic because that really centers the importance of suicide prevention and intervention work. It does work and it does help a lot of people connect with life. As well, approximately 70% of people who attempt suicide and survive never go on to make another attempt. So not only do they never die by suicide, but they may never even attempt again. And that again just really exemplifies what we're here to talk about, the importance of suicide prevention as a topic and the importance of suicide intervention. So, contextualize things a little bit more. Sometimes suicide is looked as a biomedical problem, and I really want to help kind of debunk that myth a little bit. There's this common belief that people can only think about suicide if they have a diagnosable mental health disorder. And I'm here to tell you right off the bat that is a myth for so many reasons. Suicide is really indiscriminate in who it can impact, so we don't want to really limit our scope of who we consider maybe thinking about suicide only to those who have a diagnosed mental health disorder. We know that suicide can impact anyone. There's no checklist or criteria to qualify for thoughts of suicide. This can impact anyone at any time. So we want to really be careful in how we approach that and really have an open mind as to really anyone could be thinking about suicide. So, kind of contrary to that, there's actually many factors that can contribute to someone's likelihood of thinking of suicide. And this is not an all encompassing list, but some of those include access to healthcare, housing, basic needs, pieces like that, experiences of colonization and colonialism, experiences of racism, experiences of stigma. These are all kind of determinants of health that can actually start to create the factors that may lead someone to consider suicide as an option for themselves. The main takeaway of this slide is that suicide is not solely a biomedical problem. It really needs to be looked at from a holistic, interdisciplinary lens to understand how suicide can impact people. Now, kind of bridging again, when someone's thinking about suicide, what does that really mean? So, when people are thinking about suicide, we kind of talked about that general definition right off the bat, where it's kind of this umbrella term referencing a lot of different scope in what those thoughts can look like. But what's really happening for the person when they're thinking about suicide? Now, this is not true for all, but this is true for some. People who are thinking about suicide often are experiencing what we call restricted thinking, or in other terms, tunnel vision, where they start to see limited options when confronting the emotional pain that has maybe led them to consider suicide. Now, what we mean by limited options are that it can be really hard to see other possibilities when we're in a space of constantly confronting our emotional pain and having to really sit with that and the challenges that come with that. For many people thinking about suicide, how this often manifests is one of two options that they think about. One being almost a specific or magic solution for problems to stop. And how this can sometimes manifest, or what we might hear, is people saying things along the lines of, I just wish I could wake up tomorrow and this would all be resolved. I wish I could close my eyes and all of this would go away. Those are kind of those magic solutions to the problems that we are facing that might put us in that emotional pain where we're considering suicide. Now, on the flip side of that, the other pathway that a lot of people start to think of is this almost total ending of their pain. When we can't find that magic solution, we almost look to a different extreme where how can we just get the pain to go away? And for some, that is where those thoughts of suicide start to fall in. Now, like I said, this is for some. This is not for everyone. This can vary by a lot of different things. Culture can play a big piece in this. We know for some cultural identities and some cultures, a lot of thoughts of suicide actually result from a place of shame or a place of stigma, feeling like we're shaming those that we care about, our families. We also know that this can vary across ages. This is just a general framework for how we can start to conceptualize people thinking about suicide and how challenging that can be to start to see those more hopeful possibilities when we're really in that dark space. Alrighty, so I've been spending a bit of time setting the ground for what is suicide prevention. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what does this actually look like in practice before we dive into the more practical part of this evening. When we are doing suicide prevention, what we're ultimately trying to do is connect someone who is thinking about suicide with some form of a suicide prevention resource. Now, on this slide, you see we have a person who is thinking about suicide, and then on the right hand, we have suicide prevention resources. Those can look like a lot of different things. Those can look like registered clinical counselors who have suicide prevention training. That might look like a distress line. That might look like a crisis line. That might look like a mobile crisis response team. Maybe it looks like going to the hospital. There's a lot of different resources that fall under this idea of suicide prevention resources. So, when we're talking about prevention at its core, what we're trying to do is connect the person thinking about suicide with those resources. Now, on paper, that sounds, I don't want to say easy, but that sounds conceptually like we can understand that. But in reality, there's actually a lot of barriers that get in the way of this process happening. Those barriers include things like stigma. So, the way we approach suicide as a society creates a lot of barriers for folks who are thinking about suicide and their willingness or comfort in reaching out to suicide prevention resources. As well, a lot of folks have a lack of training or education on what to do if someone is thinking about suicide. It's not that we don't care or we don't want to help. Sometimes we just don't know what to do. And that's a very scary thought where when someone comes to us and shares with us something as personal as suicide, that we might not be able to help them in the way they need. What else comes up? A lack of awareness on the availability of resources and supports. A lot of folks don't know what resources are out there, or there's a common misconception that everything has a hefty price tag attached to it. Some resources absolutely do, but there's a lot more free ones or accessible ones than I think people realize, which is really important, and I will highlight later in this presentation as well. And then finally, the big crux of a lot of this is a fear of reaching out. And this ties back to a lot of the pieces we just talked about, primarily stigma. But most people thinking about suicide are afraid to reach out for whatever reason is personal to them. Sometimes it can be they're afraid of what the response is going to be. Sometimes it might be they're afraid of seeming weak. They're afraid of the stigma that's going to be placed on them for having these thoughts. There are so many different reasons that can impact someone's willingness to reach out to a suicide prevention resource or to someone who can help connect them to a suicide prevention resource. So kind of moving into this next bit, we're going to start to talk about what can we do to try and notice when someone is struggling, how can we help them get connected to these suicide prevention resources, and what does that look like? Before we get there, though, I wanted to take a quick pause just to talk a little bit about this idea of stigma reduction and how language plays a big, big role in that. So on the screen here, I'm not going to go through every example, but we have some examples of where language is shifting to take a more destigmatized approach to how we talk about suicide. This first slide is all about using person first language. So it was common once upon a time to hear people say things like those people, the mentally ill, or addicts. And where language is really shifting here is to putting the person first, saying things like people living with mental illness, people living with addiction. This same logic can be applied when we talk about suicide. We often would hear things like a suicide victim or a suicidal person. And instead, we're trying to shift that more towards person first language and maybe saying something like a person who ended their life by suicide, or a person who's thinking about suicide, or a person who's thinking about ending their life. There's different ways that we can really be mindful in our language to contribute to the stigma reduction. And that opens up the conversation and may help people feel more comfortable talking about their thoughts with us. Now, carrying right along some more examples, this top one tends to be the one that is sticky for a lot of folks because we all grew up hearing the word commit or committed suicide. Now, where we're trying to shift language is to being just a bit more factual and neutral and saying things like ended their life by suicide or die by suicide. The reasoning here actually has a bit of a historical context. For some folks, the word commit implies that suicide is a crime or that the person who died by suicide is a criminal. Now, the historical context here is that in Canada, suicide was actually only decriminalized in 1972. So it does actually have that weight, and 1972 wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things. So when we think about our language and the context in how we share it, this is one that we want to try and shift away from. Although I know it's something we've all grown up hearing, so it does take a bit of unlearning. But here's an alternative if you're wanting to try and work on that destigmatizing language piece. As well, pretty common to hear things along the lines of a failed suicide, a failed attempt, or a successful. We're working on just dropping the language. It's not about being successful or failing. We're recognizing that people can either attempt to die by suicide or die by suicide. And then the final example here, and this one really relates to destigmatizing how we talk about suicide and the people who think about suicide, but it's very common for us to hear something like X is a high risk population or X is vulnerable to suicide. And we might hear this brought up in certain contexts. Let's say queer people are a high risk population, indigenous people are a high risk population, youth are a high risk population. And where the destigmatizing piece of that comes from is that we actually want to name what places the risk there. Being queer, being indigenous, being a youth does not inherently make us more likely to think about suicide. Instead, we should name what is those factors that contribute to that culture where we may start to think about suicide. So as an example, being queer doesn't make us think about suicide, but it might be how society treats queer identities, how society ostracizes queer identities. Being Indigenous doesn't make someone high risk. Maybe it'd be better to name the impacts of colonialism and ongoing experiences of racism, maybe those contributing factors, right? So it is really just how we reframe that language. And the more intentional we can get with naming the specific factors that might actually kind of create that idea of suicide in someone's head, as opposed to generalizing to population level, the more destigmatizing we can take, as this really starts to show people that suicide is a public health issue, like we talked about earlier. Now, that kind of wraps up us setting the stage for what we're going to do for the next little bit, talking about some practical skills. Now, one piece I forgot to mention early on is that if you have any questions kind of throughout the presentation or things you would like to address, we do have a Q&A attached to this Zoom where you're more than welcome to submit some questions. As well as I know this is a bit of a personal topic for many folks, I have our team email that you can get direct in contact with me if maybe you have a question that you would rather voice privately. That will be at the end where we'll share that email, but I just want you to know there are avenues to have your questions heard, and I encourage you to ask them. So, we just talked a lot about the issue of suicide, how these thoughts can come to be for some people, and really rooting this in a more holistic understanding as opposed to a biomedical approach. Stigma reduction is key in how we can start to contribute to suicide prevention on a large scale across society. In our small communities and our big communities, we want to really work on destigmatizing. But that's going to take a little while for us to get there. So what we can do in the meantime is start to think of how can we actually help people who may be struggling now or in the future. So how can we help people? First, I want to introduce you to this concept of intervention. Now, I know there's a lot of words on the slide. Please bear with me. Intervention is the process of actively supporting someone who is thinking about suicide and helping them increase their capacity for safety for themselves. Intervention works because the vast majority of people who are thinking about suicide are not 100% uh, like decided that they want to die. So that is a really important thing for us to remember is that the vast majority of people who are thinking about suicide are not fully in that place where they for sure want to die. Most people are kind of waiting to see those other opportunities, those other pathways forward. Now, when we're talking about a suicidal crisis or an experience of thinking about suicide, this is a period where someone may be in that space where they're considering engaging in suicide behavior. For most folks, this is actually often a very brief period. So, what the goal of intervention is to help support folks with getting them connected to resources. So, when those crises pop up, they have resources or connections that they can get in touch with around how to get support. So, during intervention, we are focused on keeping people safe through the crisis from suicide thoughts and behaviors. Now, after an intervention, and this is for my RCCs in the audience, this is when we can start to move into those longer term therapeutic supports, the work you may be doing with your client, those more pieces there around how can we actually support people in a longer term way. But when a suicide crisis pops up, we want to make sure that we're engaging in the intervention process focused on safety first and foremost. So, what I have up on the screen for you right now is the suicide continuum. You do not need to read every bit. This just kind of shows what a lot of researchers posit as how we can really engage in this suicide work. We talked a lot about prevention, that idea of destigmatizing, building protective factors, and promoting mental health and well being. Intervention is what we're going to focus really on for the last bit of this presentation. And then postvention, I'll touch on very briefly, but this is what do we do after someone has either died by suicide or engaged in suicide behaviors. This is what does that support process look like for not only the person impacted themselves, but for the people around them? How do we build those layers of support? But for today, we are heavily focused on the concept of intervention. So, this is when we're working with people who are already thinking about suicide. The goal here of intervention is to keep someone safe from suicide. And we'll bridge a little bit into how do we do that. With my team at CMHABC, we've kind of come up with a little bit of a framework, 3 steps for you to try and remember on ways that we can support someone who is thinking about suicide. The first step is noticing and asking. So, when we're noticing, this is when we're paying attention to signs that someone may be struggling. We're starting to get that gut feeling that's telling us, hey, I think there's something going on with this individual. The last part of that step is we have to ask directly about suicide. And in the coming slides, I'll give us a few examples of how we can do that. The next step there is this idea of listening. So, this is where we're listening to the person that we are supporting. It's really important to remember that for most people, they have not had an opportunity to talk about their thoughts of suicide in some capacity. So often, if we are supporting someone and we've noticed that someone may be thinking about suicide and we've asked, this might kind of like, for lack of a better term, open the floodgates. And they may have a lot to share about kind of how their experiences with these thoughts, how these thoughts came to be. All we need to do in listening is simply listen. That's the whole goal of that step. And then finally, the connect step is all about connecting the person we are supporting with suicide prevention supports. And this might include some registered clinical counselors, it might include other forms of support. And we'll talk more about that later. All right, for the first little bit, we're going to really zero in on this idea of noticing. How do we start to tune into some signs of distress, some direct signs that someone may be struggling? Generally, even with suicide off the table, people show us when they are struggling with their mental health and well being in one of two ways. Direct signs, where this can really be best conceptualized as them directly telling us that they may not be doing that well. Someone may say something to us like, I'm not doing well. We may hear things like, I wish I was dead right now. I want to kill myself. These are ways that someone is directly telling us they are not doing well. So we can pay attention for those direct signs and really start to listen to when people are telling us that they are struggling and take that seriously. That's the big piece around these direct signs is life is really tough right now. And I think it's pretty common for the bulk of us probably in this call. I know I can say I do. I'm complaining about things all the time, right? And part of tuning into suicide prevention and intervention is listening to when we hear those glimpses into someone's world where they're actually saying they're not doing well and taking that seriously. The second way that people often let us know that they're struggling with their mental health and well being are what we will call indirect signs. So, the example here are signs of distress, and that's going to look different person to person across age, across gender, across culture. How people maybe show us indirectly that they're not doing well does look very different. Now, before I go to the next slide, I do want to highlight that this kind of process I'm walking you through is an evidence based approach that our team developed and has tested in many audiences. But also, more importantly, the crux of it is person centered, meaning we don't need to necessarily consider what would I do? How would I apply this to let's say, someone who's a senior? If we're following these steps and keeping it person centered, the approach will be informed by the person we're working with. This is collaborative in nature at the end of the day. So, the reason I share that before showing you some examples of indirect signs is in keeping it person centered, we need to really remember to have a broad scope of that. This can look different person to person. Now, on this screen right now is not an all encompassing list of what these different indirect signs can look like, but I wanted to give you some examples to kind of clue you into what I'm really getting at here. We've broken it into four categories that just help us conceptualize different things we can look for. But keeping in mind, this will look different person to person. So, some things we can pay attention to are behaviors. What are some behaviors we're noticing that might be tipping us off that maybe they're not doing that well? This might be mood swings. And that doesn't mean always swinging into, let's say, a place of sadness or depression. This can also be swinging into places of anger, frustration. Emotions can pop up very differently for different people, and they can all be indicative that people are struggling in some capacity. Other behaviors to pay attention to are withdrawal. So, withdrawing from their social circles, the people in their lives, work, their hobbies, just starting to isolate a bit more and really cut off those social bits. As well, we have increased substance use up here. I would also argue decreased substance use. At the end of the day, what we're really looking for are changes in the person that we're supporting. And if we know someone to maybe be someone who uses substances quite regularly and then all of a sudden they stop, that may be something we want to pay attention to as well. So, thinking about that on a spectrum. Words that we can hear that might tip us off, things like, I hate myself, I can't go on like this. These are things that we really want to also listen to, as they may not be directly saying to us, I am not doing well, but they're glimpses in that something more may be going on. Now, feelings are things that we can sense. Again, we may not be hearing this directly, but we may sense from someone that they're really feeling hopeless. From what they're saying, it sounds like they are feeling really hopeless. Maybe we are getting senses from them that they feel isolated, they feel numb. Those are feelings we really want to tune into and pay attention to, as this can again give us that glimpse into the possibility that someone may be struggling. The final category is significant events, and these are more bigger picture considerations we want to have, where maybe we know someone who is going through a loss right now. Whether that's a death, maybe a loss of relationship, loss of routine, whatever that loss looks like, those are things that we also want to pay attention to, as significant events can really impact people to varying degrees. Another example up on the screen is the idea of rejection, and that's not just socially or relationally. Yes, we might be rejected by social groups, we may be rejected in a relationship that's important to us as well. But remember that rejection can also expand to jobs, to schooling, to so many different avenues. And we really want to, again, just really increase our awareness of what this can look like person to person. Now, I said it at the beginning, and I want to reiterate it now that this will look different person to person. This will look different across cultures. This will look different across ages, so many different factors. But really, what we're trying to tune into here, and it can feel a little gray, and unfortunately, that's one of the challenges of suicide prevention work is there is a lot of gray in what we're doing. But we're trying to tap into the gut feeling that something may be off. We're trying to notice these indirect signs in a way that start to give us that glimpse of, yeah, I'm actually worried about this person. And I might be wrong, but something about what I'm noticing or what I'm paying attention to is giving me that indication that something else may be going on. Now, you may have noticed I said, I may be wrong, because there's also the argument to be made that a lot of these are very rational reactions to not so great things that happen in our daily lives, right? But the whole point here, and the point I'm really trying to instill into us, is that we're trying to have that openness that there's a possibility that this person that we're talking to or supporting may be thinking about suicide. That openness to that possibility is often what gets missed. We sometimes write things off as rational responses to what's going on, like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like you've had a pretty stressful day. But we really want to start to open our awareness and our possibility to that gut feeling that more may be going on here. And it's okay if we're wrong. That's the whole reason we're asking. That's the whole reason we do the next step of asking to confirm that this person is or is not thinking about suicide. So, what do we do? If someone is giving off signs of distress, this typically means they want help. Not always, but typically. Now, it's really important that we follow up on these signs of distress to determine whether or not suicide is on someone's mind. And there's kind of two ways we can do this, but at the end of the day, they're accomplishing the same thing. We can either ask clearly and directly about suicide, or confirm that suicide is on their mind. And this would be in instances where maybe they have told us directly that it is. So, as an example, if someone said, "Oh, I just want to kill myself. I'm too stressed. I'm so overwhelmed." This would be an instance where we still want to confirm and go, "Hey, it sounds like maybe suicide's on your mind. Am I understanding that correctly?" It's a chance for us to gain clarity to make sure we're on the same page as what the person is putting down. In today's day and age, we've kind of shifted into this space, especially among younger audiences, where suicide is kind of used as an expression of frustration or even an expression of humor in these day and age. And that's why this confirming is really, really important, is we don't want to just overlook someone's comments that they may not be doing well around suicide just because we're assuming that it might just be an expression of frustration. We do really want to do that extra step and confirm whether or not it is suicide on their mind. But more often than not, we're going to be doing that first bullet point, which is asking clearly and directly. This tends to be the part where our heart gets a little nervous. And I'll share as a personal experience as an RCC. I worked on a crisis line for years. I've taken so many suicide prevention trainings. And the very first time I had to ask someone in person, my heart was pounding more than I ever thought it would be. It's very normal to feel uncomfortable or nervous because, really, at the end of the day, where a lot of that fear builds into is that we're afraid the answer will be yes. What do we do in the instance where the answer is yes, and we need to now support this person because we want to? It is a very scary and uncomfortable thing, but this is why it's so important, is because it is uncomfortable. We need to kind of lean into that discomfort and recognize that if that is on the mind of this person, we are doing a huge favor by asking. So, how can we do that? There's two key skills that I want to clue you into. So, the first one is asking clearly and directly. What I mean by that is we want to use language like suicide, killing yourself, or ending your life. Now, that may feel pretty uncomfortable for some people who maybe are not used to saying those words, but it is really important that we actually use that direct language because direct questions will give us direct answers. So, we want to be clear in how we ask that. And for folks who are maybe mental health professionals or maybe even registered clinical counselors on this call, this is a time where we kind of have to go against a lot of what we're trained. We're trained to really use those open ended questions. This is an instance where we want it to be close ended and direct. We want a yes or no answer with this question. Now, for some, the thought of just outright saying, "Hey, are you thinking about suicide?" really gets that heart pounding because it's a little nerve wracking. It might feel a little uncomfortable. And it might also bring up feelings of, am I just asking a bit too bluntly? Is this maybe not going to land that well for the person who I'm asking if it feels like it's coming out of nowhere? The second skill is a great way for us to build that in so it doesn't feel like it's coming out of nowhere. And we call that contextualizing our ask, or in other words, tell the person exactly why we're asking. So I'm going to jump back a few slides here, just back to those indirect signs we talked about. When we're noticing indirect signs and we're starting to pay attention to the fact that I'm nervous that someone might be thinking about suicide here, that there's more going on. Contextualizing our ask is naming what made us want to ask. So, as an example, we could say something like, "Hey, I can tell that you're feeling really burnt out and overwhelmed, and this seems to have left you even maybe feeling a little hopeless. To be honest, I'm really worried about you and I want to check in. Are you thinking about suicide?" When we contextualize our ask or we tell the person why we're asking, we're building that direct bridge between what we've noticed that has led us to want to ask and asking itself. 9 times out of 10, this is going to land really, really well because what we're doing by asking is also giving the person the opportunity to say no. We may be wrong. This person may not be thinking about suicide, but we've asked. And in the event they say no because they're just not ready to talk about it, we've also shown that we're a safe person to talk to about suicide. So maybe when they do feel ready to talk about those feelings, they know they can come back to us and talk about that. So, those are just some ideas and examples on what we can do to ask about suicide, contextualizing and then asking clearly and directly to get a clear and direct answer. Now, at this point, if we're walking through our process, we've noticed things that made us feel concerned, we've asked about suicide. What do we do if the answer is yes? Coming back to our little process here, this is when we move into the listening step. Now, I talked about this a little before, but all we are doing here is listening to the person we are supporting. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that looks like. I said this earlier, but I want to reiterate it here. Many people will not have had the opportunity to talk about their thoughts of suicide ever before. This is a heavily stigmatized thing, and a lot of people don't allow themselves to talk about it. So, by asking, sometimes we are opening up that door for folks to really share what is going on for them. All we have to do here is listen. As community helpers, we do not have to listen forever or even try to solve this person's problems for them. We can listen and help them get connected to resources. Now, for my counselors or mental health professionals in the audience as well, this is maybe a time where we can actually spend more time with our clients navigating their complicated thoughts and feelings of suicide with them. So, what this listening step looks like will vary depending on our relationship with the person and the scope of training or comfort we have. But truly, at its crux, we are just listening to what the person is going through. And just like that, the listening step is done because at its core, it is really just about being there as a safe and supportive presence. For some folks, this may take 2 minutes. For other folks, this may take a lot of time. And that's okay. We let the person speak in the capacity they're willing to, and we support them through that process. Because what we're really trying to do as we start to wrap up the listening portion is help this person get connected to supports. So let's talk about what are some resources out there and how can we start to do that connection. So, this is where we want to look at ways we can increase this person's capacity for safety. Remember, intervention is all about increasing capacity for safety. Now, we can help people get connected to a suicide prevention resource. On my next slide, I'm going to walk you through a bunch of resources that are out there in the community. For community helpers, we can let people who are struggling with thoughts and feelings of suicide know that their thoughts and feelings are valid and that they also are worthy and deserving of help. This is a really important piece that we want to sell people on because a lot of folks thinking about suicide may start to backpedal a little bit at this stage and go, it's not that serious for me. Like, I'm not, that help could be better used for others, right? But this is where, no matter how we perceive the risk or the severity, we really want to communicate that all thoughts of feelings of suicide are deserving of help. And that's where there's resources for everyone. Now, as counselors, with the training and education and knowledge you have, this may be where you may be the suicide prevention resource, and you may be more suited to do that more in-depth intervention work, or looking at helping them get referred to one of these next resources. Some of that more in depth intervention work may look like risk assessing, safety planning, documentation, all those pieces. And those are things that we want to consider what that looks like in our practice as counselors who are supporting clients thinking about suicide. So I keep talking about these resources, but what are they? They're up on the screen now, and I'm going to walk you through all of them. I'll walk through the ones we've already been through a little quicker. But 911, the reason it's up here is that 911 is one of the only immediately available resources that also has life-saving medical support. So for folks who maybe are imminently planning on taking steps to end their life or who are in the process of taking steps to end their life, 911 is often the best call because there is that immediately available life-saving support via an ambulance. Now, we talked a little bit about 988, but for folks who maybe have joined us after I spoke about that, 988 is nationwide. You can call or text, and they do specialize in just general crisis support, but also suicide prevention. 1-800-SUICIDE BC's 24/7 phone line, completely free to access, available 24/7, call based, and you can speak to an anonymous person who will support the person thinking about suicide. KUAS Indigenous Crisis Line serves the entire province 24/7. They offer kind of more culturally respective and safe supports while still also offering that suicide intervention and crisis de escalation piece. The Lamathut Crisis Line is operated by the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. They also provide cultural safe supports for Indigenous identifying folks or folks that were impacted by the residential school system. And they are also available 24/7 as well. Now, a very different type of resource that I want to make you aware of is what we call Circle. So, this is a crisis response community led team. And they are popping up in more and more communities around BC. But really, at the core, what they are is they're a mobile crisis response team where you'll have a peer support worker and a mental health clinician paired together going into community to sit with people who are actively in crisis, including thinking about suicide. They will be there and engage in all of their crisis de escalation to support the person until they're in a stable and more safe place. Now, this is a newer program, but it is really cool because it's not only immediately available, but they also will come to you in community, which is really fantastic. That's not something that most crisis lines can offer due to the phone based nature. Now, the current community circle are Victoria, New Westminster, the North Shore of Vancouver, Comox Valley on the island, Prince George, and Kamloops. But there are more and more that are popping up. There is a new one that will be coming momentarily as well in a community in BC, and we're seeing them come into more and more communities throughout the province. Now, if you don't have a circle program in your community, no worries. There is an alternative as well called a CAR program. The main difference with a CAR program is that they have the mental health clinician and a plainclothes police officer. Now, there's not a list to my knowledge of just all the CAR programs available, but they are also mobile crisis response teams. But you can check with your local police department to see if you have a CAR program. They're often called like CAR and then a number, so like CAR 49 or something like that. The final two resources I'm going to touch on quickly, the Kids Help Phone. So, Kids Help Phone, fantastic service, especially for younger identifying folks. And a funny learning for me recently was that the name Kids Help Phone is slightly misleading, as they actually serve people up to 30. Now, they are a fantastic resource that's available call, text, or even online chat. And they also have counselors that oversee the calls coming in to help provide that extra layer of support with the responders. So just keep that one in mind as well. If you're working with folks in the range of 20 to 30, you might have to convince them to call the kids help phone because they might be like, I'm not a kid, but the services do extend up to that age. Now, the final suicide prevention resource I want to highlight are RCCs, registered clinical counselors who are trained in suicide prevention. This is something that we can also take a big role on in supporting not only our clients, but the general community and receiving clients that way of folks who may be thinking about suicide and providing them with that more ongoing long term support as well as intervention. Whew, was a lot of yapping about resources, but that this final section I'm going to walk you through is just really about self-care. Now, the I want to kind of wrap up with self-care and maybe have a bit of time for questions because this type of work is very heart heavy. And I know like I said, we've got RCCs, mental health professionals, and community members in the audience. And I really want to sell the importance of self care when we are engaging in suicide prevention work. We've just spent about 40 minutes talking about how we can notice, listen, and connect for others, but you can also do this for yourself. So notice signs that you may be feeling out, burnt out, exhausted, etc. Listen to those signs. That's the part that we're all pretty bad at. We're pretty good at noticing when we're not doing well, but we don't listen necessarily to what those signs mean and how we can support ourselves. And then we can connect ourselves with self care strategies, supports, and resources and more so that we can start to learn how we can support ourselves, not only through this work, but just in general. Little message on the bottom there that self care is not selfish and that we deserve and need to take care of ourselves before we can take care of others. All right. Now, there was no way we were going to be able to talk about the whole scope of suicide prevention and intervention in an hour. So you may be having some lingering questions, and I want to kind of point you towards some opportunities to learn more or how you can get in touch. At CMHABC, we will be launching in 2026 a new educational program called SPACE. It stands for Suicide Prevention and Awareness Community Education. This is designed for both community audiences and all the way up to helping professionals as well to learn very important skills in how we can support people. We have a 1 hour workshop on prevention, which is aimed at increasing awareness and reducing stigma, an intervention course for community where you learn early and kind of entry intervention skills to help support someone thinking about suicide. So, what does that look like from a more skills based approach? We also have an intervention course for clinicians and helping professionals who are maybe looking to learn some of those more in depth skills that may show up in session or in the work you do, such as safety planning, risk assessment, proper documentation, ethical considerations, and pieces like that. The final course we're offering is on postvention. This is workplace oriented to help workplaces, collectives start to consider what a postvention plan may look like if that's relevant and applicable to your workplace. Now, as well, we do also do some custom policy work. If you're interested in having suicide prevention policy integrated into your workplace, reach out to us. We love to chat about what that can look like. Sometimes I say this and people go, I don't really know if that's for my workplace. Our main clients have been climbing gyms, hotel chains. People are recognizing that suicide prevention policy really shows up in all different workplaces. Finally, there are also some courses offered more broadly as well, such as Safe Talk and Assist. You may have heard of these courses before. These are also community oriented courses to help folks learn intervention skills and community based skills training in suicide prevention. Now, this is where I'll pause. I recognize we only have 5 minutes left, not a ton of time for questions. But if we do have any questions, I will hopefully try to answer one or two. But you may also see on the screen, we have our email, suicideprevention@cmha.bc.ca. That is how you can directly get in touch with me, as well as the larger suicide prevention team. If you have questions that maybe didn't get a chance to get answered today, or ones that you would like to ask privately, I highly encourage you to reach out to us. We would love to chat with you and talk more about suicide prevention. So with that, well, thank you, Nikki, for popping that in there. I have not been able to fully see the chat with the way my split screen is set up. So Nikki, I don't know if there's any questions that have come through.
Well, there's a couple I think that you addressed. I'm just going to go to my document here. Thank you so much, honestly, Matt, for all of
Thank
that.
you.
Do you have a dog down there?
I have a cat that's now
Cat,
getting a
okay.
little feisty.
I want to thank you so much for bringing so much information forward. I think you may have answered a couple of the questions,
Awesome.
one being in terms of age-related stats of
Mm.
suicide considerations, but you really brought that forward right after that question was posed. And I think it was much more paying attention to behaviors, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think too, like for the age-related stats, there definitely are age-related statistics. And the tricky thing there is I don't know them off the top of my head, but really just reminding ourselves that this is indiscriminate. And sometimes when we look at those stats, they try to really sell us that certain groups are more impacted. And it's not that they're not, but we want to not let those stats guide who we think is at risk of suicide or who may be thinking about suicide. For whoever asked that question around the stats, I would happily send you some afterwards if you want to get in touch. Shoot us an email.
Yeah, so the email is there. I hope I the spelling was right as I did it.
That's right.
And then I think the only other one that cropped up was what about someone hearing suicidal thoughts?
Yes. So hearing suicidal thoughts can be really challenging as the helper, right? When we are like hearing that, I'm assuming this means when we're hearing it from someone else. And that can be really challenging. It can be really heavy. And that's when we want to really start to bridge into that. How do we support people? Paying attention to that and listening. That when we start to hear those thoughts, that's when we want to act proactively. And I guess one thing I didn't mention, but an important consideration is that we might get to the end of this and really think, hey, you know what? I'm not sure I'm ever going to be the right person to support someone thinking about suicide. And that's okay. What I would encourage you to think of, though, is if someone does come to you with thoughts of suicide, where can we maybe send them? Where might be a good spot for us to help them still get that support, even if this falls outside of our boundaries? Because it's really important that we listen to our boundaries and comforts when hearing suicidal thoughts, but we still need to make sure that we get some folks connected to the support.
Yeah.
Now, I did just see two super quick questions, Nikki, that I'll respond to. One was, how do we sign up for space? Incredible question. Right now, it's not publicly live. So if you're interested, reach out to us and we'll add you to a wait list for when that goes live. So just reach out to the email if you want to learn more. This will have a more public launch in 2026, and I'm sure you'll hear about it through various channels, but definitely reach out if you're interested in learning more. We can chat. I also saw someone ask, is there a template we recommend for safety planning with RCCs? And yes and no. The general kind of one that a lot of folks go to is the Stanley Brown safety plan. And that is a fantastic safety plan template. It has a really beautiful tiered approach where it helps you walk your clients through what do we do if we're having thoughts of suicide, but we're in a place where we can distract ourselves. Who can we go to for distraction? What are some places we can go? And it kind of builds down in severity. The goal is that as your client's working through it, they're reaching more and more intensive supports. Our kind of not critique, sorry, this is my cat. Our not critique but consideration of the Stanley Brown safety template is that the piece around like mean safety and the more in the immediate need for support around like life and death mean safety is at the bottom. So I just would caution clinicians who are using that to maybe find a way to put like that mean safety or how can folks stay physically safe more near the top of a safety plan template, as that should be one of the first things our clients see.
That is excellent, Matt. I think you addressed all the questions. I hope you can see
Yay.
the appreciation going on in the
Thank you
chat.
all.
And I just want to commend you on really bringing this forward to two very different audiences and bringing so much value to everyone. So
Thank you.
thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And we'll have the recording available. And we just look forward to seeing you at one of our future events.
Thank you,
So,
Nikki. Thank you all, and get in touch.
yeah.